All right, Lone Star Gunners, welcome to Lone Star Gun Talk. I am your host, as always, Derek Wills, and I am really looking forward to today's show. Today, we are going to be talking about gun control, and I know we've been talking about that for a while now, but this is going to be a special one, because with us today, we have a special guest, and that is Ed Scruggs from Texas Gun Sense. I'm sure everybody here knows who Texas Gun Sense is. They are a very vocal gun control support group in the state of Texas. And they have been gracious enough to engage in a conversation about gun control behind enemy lines. And that means a lot, because if you've listened to this program for a while, I have always encouraged a very productive dialogue, even if you both walk away completely disagreeing. And the fact that we have representatives from Texas Gun Sense here really means the world to me. I'm glad that they're here, even though we completely disagree on the subject and the policies that should be instituted. I feel like this is going to be a great conversation. But before we get into that, I want to thank our sponsor for this week's episode, and that is No Surrender Holsters. If you are like me and you love anything that complements your firearms or knives, then you know that nothing complements it better than a custom Kydex holster or sheath. No Surrender Holsters can do anything that you would like and make it your very own one-of-a-kind holster. And if you check them out on Facebook at No Surrender Holsters, take a look at some of the work that they've done. And you will see the difference just in the pictures compared to other manufacturers. They're all made here in the Lone Star State with nationwide shipping, of course. And if you contact AJ and tell him that you want a No Surrender holster, and you tell him that you heard it here on Lone Star Gun Talk, he will give you free shipping, and you cannot beat that. Check him out today on Facebook at No Surrender Holsters. I have put a link in the podcast description. Let them know that we sent you and get your free shipping, and I hope that you enjoy your No Surrender holster. All right, guys, here it is. We have with us Ed Scruggs from Texas Gun Sense, and we are going to have I can feel it. We're going to have a good conversation on gun control. Ed, welcome to Lone Star Gun Talk, sir.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Hey, no problem. It's my pleasure. First, before we get into policy and things like that, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do at Texas Gun Sense, what motivated you to get involved with gun control advocacy and all of that.
Well, I'm currently the vice chairperson of our board of directors at Texas Gun Sense and spokesperson. I do a lot of the media interviews for the group. We're a nonprofit based here in Texas. All of our volunteers are from Texas and from around the state, and almost all of our funding also comes from Texas. I got involved in these issues after Sandy Hook. I was always concerned about it, of course. But as things were building after the Aurora Theater shooting, some other incidents, but then when Sandy Hook happened, just hit me really hard. I could only compare it to the feeling I had after 9/11 in some ways. I had a daughter who was that same age, who was in the hospital that morning having surgery. And so a lot of things combined just to really hit me like a ton of bricks. And in the days following that, just met folks online from around town here in Austin that I did not know, but we all had similar feelings. And we got together and started working on these issues. Texas Gun Sense was actually started a few years before that during the debate over campus carry. And had grown during that time, but following Sandy Hook, kind of the scope broadened out and became an official nonprofit organization, and just grew from there.
Right on. So you're very passionate about this, obviously, and you know, from a gun control or even a gun rights perspective, I think it's important that for most people, anyway, we both have the same end game. We both want to make sure that tragedies don't happen. We just have a very different means of going about that end. And, I've said 1,000 times, it is okay to disagree, and we can disagree agreeably. You and I
Hmm.
we can be completely polar opposite. I can believe that everything that you say is contrary to our founding principles, and that's okay. We can disagree agreeably. So let's talk policy here. If you could enact any legislation that you wanted just by waving a magic wand, your uh, your philosophy would be put into place. What would gun laws in the United States look like?
Well, obviously, very different than they are right now. I think our organization works on many fronts, but I think the overarching policy that we think would be a top priority would be universal background checks, if not fully universal, mostly universal, um, with a good, strong background check system, fixing many of the errors that we've seen recently, and applying to private sales, most internet sales, and so forth and so on. Um, that would be a top priority, and also in areas that, when you talk about the areas of mental health or family safety, we've seen a recent move towards what some people call a gun violence restraining order. We call a lethal violence restraining order, where when someone such as the shooter in Florida is exhibiting very odd and disturbing behavior, violence towards parents and other individuals, that police or family can make a request of a judge that we have a restraining order to remove those guns until the person is examined and judged to be competent to get them back. We think that would go a long way in preventing domestic violence, gun related deaths, and abuse. Um, Other than that, a variety of different things. We of course oppose concealed carry reciprocity, which is currently being proposed across the states. Um, we would also like to see increased funding for firearm safety and education, especially gun storage in the home. The accidental deaths of children in the home is a big problem. On my social media feeds, every time one happens, I see it come across, and it happens daily. And it's a terrible tragedy and completely preventable. But I think that's a good place to start.
Okay, so you said a lot. Let's kind of take
Sure.
this kind of step by step. Although I might have to go back and listen because I might miss something. But you
Sure.
started with universal background checks,
Uh huh.
and that's something that gets thrown around a lot. Um, so, we don't support background checks at all, even the current system, and I know that probably drives you crazy. Uh, but how would your version of background checks differ from the current NICS background check system that we already have?
Well, I think the legislation that's currently proposed to fix next to fix some of those holes in the system needs to go through. Um, right now, a big weakness in the system is that governmental entities, they don't have the incentive to report. States, it's not mandatory that they report, and different states have different systems. So you have actually Texas, which does a fairly good job of reporting mental health records and other records to the system, as opposed to a state like Oklahoma, where a few years ago they did a study, and over the period of a few years, they only had 3 people reported to the system for the entire state because they left that up to the counties to come up with to be responsible for that. They didn't have to report to a central database in the state. And so that it's just uneven and it misses a lot of people. We can do a lot to change that for one thing, and pick up more of those folks. I think being able to contact someone on the internet or on Craigslist and go to, the Costco parking lot somewhere and being able to buy a weapon, that's just not safe. And I think most people um, believe that to be the case. I mean, there's just no background check involved there. We have no idea who's selling, who's buying, etc. And obviously that's a big gaping hole in the system. We need to change that. In the area of family transfer from a son to, from a father to a son or a grandfather to a grandson, there's some room there where, we can talk family heirlooms and some things like that. But I just think right now it's so easy to get around the background check system that it doesn't work as near as effectively as it should.
Okay. You mentioned, for example, accidents. You said accidents are a huge issue.
Hmm.
Uh, and I'm looking at the CDC statistics on this from 2015. And this is causes of death. And I'm well aware that there are accidental discharges where injuries occur.
Hmm.
Uh, but as far as deaths are concerned, from accidental discharge of firearms in 2014, there were 489 total.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
I don't really see that as a major issue.
Well, I think it's. I think one thing that you can argue though is that every one of those deaths is preventable, and that's, we have regulations for um, baby bassinets and strollers because maybe two children, three children a year might accidentally be caught in them and suffocate, and so it is a significant issue in the sense of. As I mentioned, now that people are really following this and keeping track, when it happens, it makes local news. It does get carried on social media, etc. And it's always the same story. It is a horrible, tragic event that involves usually a young child, maybe a sibling, sometimes a parent, and someone left their weapons out. They were cleaning them and walked away, or they just weren't very careful with them, or the young child, they find a way to find them in the house. And the one thing that I've learned from working in this field over time is um, the ripple effect of these gun violence deaths throughout a family, throughout the neighborhood where they occur. They're tremendously traumatizing to everyone. And so 400 deaths, that's an awful lot of trauma out there, and a lot of people that are affected that'll never be the same because of it. And the fact that they are all preventable, pretty much all preventable, I just don't understand why, for example, there is some opposition to increasing funding for education on how to store weapons properly. Um, it just doesn't make any sense. That's the one thing at the Texas legislature that we lobbied heavily for last session was for Department of Public Safety to designate a small portion of the license to carry fee towards a public relations campaign or an education program. And there was resistance there, but there was also a lot of bipartisan support. But everyone was afraid to touch the issue. They didn't want it to get out of committee and they didn't want to touch it. Where to me, that is something that's just so basic that there's a lot of agreement on that, hey, education isn't going to harm anyone. Education isn't going to take anyone's rights away, and it might save a few lives. So that's was one of the more disappointing things last session. We do believe, obviously, there's a lot of people that need the education because these incidents are still happening.
Well, here's the thing on that. Yes, any untimely death is tragic, and I'm not trying to downplay those 480, whatever the number was. My phone's off now, but whatever that number was, I'm not trying to downplay that as it's just a number. But you have to. I feel very strongly that you have to look at this from an overall standpoint. You're talking 400 and change in a nation of 325 million. You I don't believe that there is any law, regulation, rule, etc., that can be implemented to make that zero consistently every single year. I don't
Mhm.
think that you can make that zero for homicides or
Mhm.
armed robbery or anything like that. And because you can't make it zero, and I, we'll get into this a little bit later, but I don't think crime in general in this country is a substantial issue. Yeah, it's tragic whenever people get murdered, raped, their property is stolen from them. It's awful, and I don't wish that upon anybody. But I think that it's kind of also tragic to strip away people's rights, good, honest people's rights, over a very minor issue. And I say that from a purely statistical standpoint. So you said education. You
Mhm.
talked a lot about education. And here's the problem that I have with mandated education. Government mandate, anytime the government runs anything, they never run it effectively. Have you ever taken the LTC course?
No, I have not.
Okay. The LTC course is basically just a quick synopsis of what the laws are, and they touch on it very, uh, very lightly. Whenever I got my LTC, it was a 10-hour requirement. Now it's down to 4, I think. And even that, I felt like it was a 10-hour waste of my day, because it's not government education, even those done by private individuals, because the government dictates the curriculum. It's not an effective uh, form of education. I agree that education is important, but I believe that private industry should have the solution to that. You know, you go to any gun range or gun shop, they will either provide you with education or recommend somebody who is willing to educate you. And that goes for anybody, for anything. There are ranges that have basic maintenance classes all the way to full tactical classes if they have the facility for it. And education's out there. I just don't think that the state should be the one to run it or mandate it. Because
Well, and I think, I think one of the issues here is that we're not proposing necessarily that you have to take a mandated course or anything of that. I think that the thought process would be more along the lines of, for example, how you may see DPS run a billboard on the side of the highway, click it or ticket. You're going to get a ticket if you don't wear a seatbelt, that kind of thing, just as a reminder to people to pay attention to what they're doing. And you're right, it's not going to completely eliminate all of these accidental deaths. That's impossible. But I think there are more people. Now, I don't have exact statistics on this, but I would bet my bottom dollar that more people are prosecuted each year for leaving their child in a locked car while they go in the store. And we do hear about those deaths as well, but they're almost always charged in some way when a death occurs, and that's because it's just reckless endangerment, basically, an
I'm
endangerment of a child.
right. I'm
And
sorry to interrupt, Ed.
sure,
You have my agreement on that. I do agree that anytime an adult is negligent and it results in the death of a child, because a child cannot legally, from a legal standpoint, make decisions for itself. So
yes.
if a parent is reckless and leaves their loaded firearm out, and a child finds it and pulls the trigger and shoots somebody, shoots themselves, or just hits drywall, yeah, I think that there should be legal penalties for that. And I don't think that anybody, and keep in mind, I'm a Second Amendment purist. I'm far more hardcore than the NRA. I've blasted the NRA on this program several times because I think that they're spineless, but that's neither here nor there. I think that I don't think anybody would disagree that if a parent is stupid enough to leave their loaded firearm out and their child finds it and kills somebody or does something with it, that they should not face charges. The parent should not face charges. They should. Absolutely. I just don't want to see any sort of mandates that the only way it's really enforceable is to have law enforcement go around knocking on doors.
Oh, and I think you have some agreement from me there as well. I don't. I think that's when you get so intrusionary. That's just one. From that standpoint, it's impossible to enforce. But I'm glad that you do say that there is a responsibility there on behalf of the parent, and I can tell you cases that um, we have studied, and someone is leaving a gun out on the nightstand next to their bed because they feel they need it to be accessible in order to defend themselves at night. They wake up in the middle of the night, etc. They leave it there, and a child comes in and gets it. Things of that nature. Um, that is negligent. It's district attorneys in many states, not just Texas, but they're very reluctant to file charges or enforce the law in those cases because they feel, well, it's such a tragedy, it's the parents have already suffered so much, etc. So they often don't charge them. And I certainly, it is a tragedy and they have suffered. But that's one way I think when these events happen that people will learn, hey, there is a consequence if I am negligent. And I don't know. There's just a tendency sometimes for law enforcement and district attorneys to kind of just get past it and not go there with the charge. And
Right.
I personally would like to see that changing. But in terms of laws to prevent it, it's very difficult to do. There may be some things that could be done to encourage district attorneys to enforce the statute, things of that nature,
Right.
because right
Well,
now they're not.
also keep in mind that every situation is different. And, I know that the way that laws are typically written, they want to lay it out generally so that way anything that kind of falls under that umbrella can get prosecuted. One of the things that I don't favor for anything are like mandatory minimum sentences because every case is different. And it doesn't
Mhm.
matter if it's a first degree homicide. It doesn't matter if it's you name the charge. Every case is different. So I'm not one who supports things like mandatory minimums. And even if a district attorney were to take a look at this and uh, and decide not to prosecute, I think that should be up to him. But I think that we're kind of getting on off into the weeds into
Sure.
this line of dialogue. So let's kind of back up a bit and let's talk about crime, the way crime is in the current state. You obviously are very passionate about gun control because of what you've seen on the
Mhm.
news and everything that you've heard about and seen on social media. Because if you look at it, excuse me, if you look at it, you seem to think that this sort of thing happens all the time. And if it were up to the media narrative, and not to sound all tinfoil hatty, I'm not, but they do have an agenda and they push that agenda, and that's all media outlets. And you would think, the average person would think that this sort of thing is a regular occurrence that affects so many Americans every year. And from a purely statistical standpoint, it's not. Um, you can check these numbers if you'd like. I can provide you with the links if you want. But I was looking at the 2016 FBI Uniform Crime Report. I'm a big numbers guy. I don't know if you could tell. Numbers mean a lot to me, and as somebody who has experienced the untimely death of somebody, and somebody at the barrel of a gun, I realize that I can't let my emotions dictate what good public policy would be, because I maintain the fact that if you're emotionally thinking about something, you can't necessarily be logical about it because your emotions are driving it. So I try and be as unemotional whenever it comes to this discussion as possible, just because I think that if you're going to have a discussion on public policy, it should be completely rooted in logic without any sort of emotion attachment. So, looking at the 2016 reports, the population of the U.S. was just shy of 325 million. Okay. And taking all of the violent crimes that were committed and reported, which I am well aware that there are some that do not get reported, but all of them that do get reported in 2016, there were 1.2 million violent crimes, 368,000 of which were committed with a firearm. And if you do the math, that's 0.36% of Americans were affected by violent crime, and 0.11% of Americans were affected by violent crime with a firearm. This is homicide, rape, aggravated assault, armed robbery, you name it. I don't see 0.3% as anything substantial. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, statistically, in the broad view, you're right. I mean, crime is lower. It's lower than I remember as a child growing up in the 70s and the 80s for sure, and in the early 90s. And sometimes people are either too young or they don't remember how significant crime was then. Crime is down. But I think the estimates of gun related deaths per year range sometimes between 30,000, 33,000. About two-thirds of those are suicides, and then the rest would be homicides. Um, the Again, I talked about the ripple effect of gun violence, what that does. When someone is a victim of gun violence, even if they don't die but they're just injured, uh, the trauma of that is very significant. That extends outward amongst their social circle, people they know, etc. And the same thing goes with suicide. Um, and the When you talk about, for if you're going to talk about mass shootings, which is that's what people tend to focus on because it's just so explosive and so out there, it just has an impact on people's psyche that is an intangible effect. It scares people in the way that terrorism scares people. And so people feel uneasy when they're out in public now, when they go to a movie theater, when they go to pick up their kids at school or drop them off, when they go to the supermarket and things of this nature. And it's just, and part of this, I agree, the media has definitely played a role in hyping it. I don't want to say hyping it up, but it's just the news cycle focuses on these events so much that you really can't escape that now. And People are on edge and people are scared. I think one of the questions that I have, and you might be able to answer for me, is we know that crime is lower and your chances of being involved in a violent incident are low. But why are gun sales so high? I One of the things that we often deal with in Texas when we're working on legislation is people will say, well, I'm a purist and I don't want anything to restrict my right to defend myself. I must defend myself whenever I'm out with my family somewhere, etc. But then again, statistically, the chances of people being involved in a crime are so low. What do you think is behind the increase in gun sales and the view of this heightened need to protect oneself?
I firmly believe that the reason that gun sales just go up and up and up every single year are because of the political threat that these type of weapons are going to be banned. And I think that shows how much people care about their natural right to bear arms. And you know, I also firmly feel that our rights have been infringed upon, and I called it a natural right for a reason. That is a tenet of mine deep in my soul, that our right to bear arms, it doesn't come from government. It is a natural right. For me specifically, I believe that right comes from God. Uh, and the threat that our rights are going to be diminished more are why gun sales are going up. And I believe that they've been diminished and infringed on since 1934 with the passage of the National Firearms Act. And every decade or so, we get another infringement. And so it's about that time, if you look at history, with the passage of another gun control bill at the federal level. And people are, they're tired of seeing their rights chipped away. And that's why you see those gun sales. What do you think about that?
Well, I think you're right in the sense of that there are certainly many people who believe that, and they are buying multiple weapons based on that premise. You mentioned the Firearms Act of 1934, which banned Tommy guns and put regulations on several things. Um, that was done, of course, in the midst of gang warfare and gangsters, and in the midst of the Prohibition Wars and so forth and so on. That there was the need. Okay, we need to put a cap on some of these things.
Mhm.
And I think the average person would have a very hard time believing that we need Tommy guns on the street, that that's really something they would view that as an offensive weapon and not a defensive weapon. I think that's one of the issues that you have with assault style weapons today, is that the AR-15, for example, is viewed as an offensive weapon and not a defensive weapon, and so forth and so on. And so the average person who may not shoot or may not own weapons or may just have very limited experience, they just have a hard time with kind of an unlimited um, marketplace for weapons. They just don't understand it because they obviously don't feel threatened enough. Maybe they have a handgun in their home, but they don't need to feel that they need to have 10 of them in their home, or that they need to have some of these more powerful weapons in their home. They would probably ask, okay, well, isn't there a line? How much is too much? And what do you say to that if someone says, is there no limit? I mean, do you think there should be absolutely no restrictions on the types of weapons that you should be able to carry?
Absolutely. I think that any law, regulation, piece of legislation that is on the federal books regarding firearms, I feel is an infringement. And, you know, I want to go back real quick, and then we can go back to that
Sure.
answer. You said that people view the AR platform as an offensive weapon, and I
Hmm.
think that you're right. I think that the average person, especially the average non-gun owner,
Hmm.
will view that as an offensive weapon. And this is where your talking point on education comes in, because it's not. And I'm also not for the 1986 ban on full auto weapons that Reagan signed. I think that was a gross infringement, and uh, a lot of people will think that I'm nuts, especially whenever you look at the incident in Las Vegas where the guy uses a bump stock
Hmm.
and he fires into a concert crowd. Here's the thing, though. Even the Army Field Manual. I'm a Navy veteran, and I have a lot
Hmm.
of experience in these types of weapons. I was an armor, and I was a firearms instructor, a small arms instructor there. Fully automatic fire is not an effective method of weapons employment. It's just not. I am steadfast in my belief that had the guy in Vegas, and I'm not one that likes to repeat their names because I think that kind of perpetuates the problem.
Hmm.
I firmly believe that had he just stuck with a semi-automatic form of fire, not a bump, I know it's not really fully automatic, but had he not used a bump stock, I think that the total number of shot would have been lower, but I think the total number killed would have been higher. And the reason is that whenever you're shooting in a fully automatic style of fire, your accuracy is completely diminished. In the military, full auto is only used in a defensive posture. And the only reason that you need to use it, even using a belt fed machine gun, is you are trying to keep your enemy's head down while your teammates go around their flank or something of that nature. Or in our case in the Navy with the M2HB 50 cal machine gun and other crew served weapons. The reason you do that is because it is very hard to shoot a small boat attack with anything other than accuracy by volume, is what we call it, because
Hmm.
you are dumping so much ammo in the hopes of hitting, because you are not accurate in that form of fire. And in a crowd, yeah, you will have a lot more hit, but the vast majority of them will not be nearly as fatal as if you were to use a semi-automatic function. And I might be making the case for you for a ban on semi-automatics, which I don't believe in either. But I feel that it's very important that people realize that the full auto ban of 1986 and bump stocks, if I say you generally, if somebody wanted to inflict chaos upon a group of people, that's not the best method to do it. It's just not. And that's based off of my training as a veteran. So,
and just in taking that into account, you mentioned that you didn't favor the ban on full auto, and so you don't think that bump stocks and so forth should be outlawed, etc. It's making the case that it is more of a defensive use than an offensive use.
yes.
But the average person would say, well, sure, that's a defensive use if you're being invaded by an army, or you have ISIS coming down the street with 10 guys or something like that. Whereas most people, I think, when they're thinking of self-defense in the home, they are probably thinking a shotgun or a handgun for an intruder.
And they would
Why would
absolutely. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. Go
no,
ahead.
but that's they don't understand why the average person would think that they need that kind of firepower on that level as a defensive alternative.
Okay. Now, I could go with the generalized gun rights talking point and say it's not about needs. It's not the Bill of Needs. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to approach this from a practical perspective because there is actually a need out there. I promise that if I owned a business in Baltimore or in Ferguson, Missouri, when the riots were going on, I would want a couple 100-round drum magazines and a fully automatic M4 to defend that. Because people were rioting in the streets and destroying businesses, which is destroying livelihoods. And whenever there is a mob like that, it's rare. Absolutely, it's rare. Violent crime in general is incredibly rare in this country. But I don't want to be a victim, and I don't want anybody else to be a victim. So is there a situation, a realistic situation, where somebody would have the need for 100-round drum magazines or a belt-fed machine gun? Absolutely. And all you got to do is look at the recent riots, and you could even look at the LA riots.
What would you say to now? This is an idea that's also been tossed around. I mean, people talk about an assault weapons ban or semi-automatic rifle ban, etc. And our organization is not calling for that, but we have asked the question about, well, what about just a little tighter regulation on those weapons, a higher class of license, or a little more training, etc. So when, let's say, you have someone such as a business owner or someone with an interest such as that they would have the right to have something like that, but they would just have to have a little more education. They would have to have a license to carry it, et cetera, et cetera. What would you think about that?
Well, the problem that I have with that is my core belief that the right to bear arms, and that is a general use of the word arms, is that it is a God-given or natural right, depending upon your belief systems. Because I believe that this right doesn't come from government, it comes from beyond government. I think that the government doesn't have the authority to impose such regulations since they weren't the ones to grant it to begin with. If you start putting regulations on it, which we've been doing since 1934, and in some cases even before that, whenever you put regulations on it, that means that it's no longer a natural right. It means it's a government-granted privilege. And I don't think that natural rights should be treated that way.
Hmm. Well, and that is a belief that's out there, certainly. I, and this is just my own personal questions to folks, though, is uh, if the right to bear arms is a natural right and God given, then the whole Constitution would be as well. And then you could make the argument then, well, why do we have any laws? Why do we have a speed limit? Why do we require seatbelts? That type of thing. I mean, we have restrictions in our lives that are elected representatives of the government. We've come together and we've agreed on those things. If we don't like the laws, we can elect other people to change them, etc. Why do you believe that guns are different, though,
I
compared
don't.
to?
I don't believe that guns are different. This might actually shock some of my listeners, and or it might not. I'm far more of a libertarian than anything else. I believe that we have a lot of natural rights that are being infringed on. Now, you brought up things like why have any laws? So, my philosophy whenever it comes to criminal law is that nothing should be illegal if unless the act in and of itself directly infringes upon the rights of another human being. So, homicide, for instance, you can't just go up and shoot somebody in the face because you feel like it, because they have the right to live and you took that away from them. So, you need to establish a punishment for that. Whenever it comes to a lot of these laws that are on the books, like in Texas, it's a felony to carry a handgun or any weapon into a bar.
Mm-hmm.
It's this. Did you ever see the movie Minority Report?
Oh, yes.
Okay. In my mind, it's a lot like that. It's kind of this proactive approach to prevent crime. So, in order to do that, because we don't want people mixing alcohol and firearms, and I'm an adamant believer in that. I just don't think it should be a legal mandate, but that's a whole nother discussion. Because we don't want people to mix alcohol and firearms, we're just going to make it illegal for them to go into a bar. Well, I'm not a drinker. I drink maybe 2 or 3 beers a month at most, and I do go into bars quite a bit. Not because I'm drinking, but maybe I enjoy the food there. Maybe I'm out with my wife and she's meeting some friends or what have you. There are plenty of examples, and I'm not the only one, where I feel like my rights are being infringed upon by a state-mandated infringement that says you shall not carry into a bar. It's a preemptive, proactive approach to try and tackle a problem that is not an issue. Again, going back to the purely statistical data, none of this is an issue. It's infringement on our rights to correct a non-existent problem.
Now, for example, you have this brings to mind to my remember when I was a kid, and drunk driving was a lot more accepted than it is today. And I remember actually an incident where there were times my dad would pick me up from school, and he would have a beer in the car, and he would drink that beer on the way home. And one time he made a bad U-turn and we got in an accident. Police stopped us, and you're not drunk, it's okay. They let him go, basically. Well, deaths and highway deaths per capita were much higher then, until we started toughening up laws on drunk driving, lowering the standard to 0.10, then 0.08, and so forth and so on. And we've seen, with also technology and seatbelt laws and airbags, over time, traffic fatalities per capita have dropped significantly. So you can argue that hundreds of thousands of lives may have been saved in that case, but people can still drive cars and they can still do their things. And if people want to drive drunk, they can, but they know that there is definitely a penalty if they do. And it does prohibit some people from doing that and makes them think twice. Why can't we have that same approach with guns?
As far as from an intoxication standpoint, or what?
Well, no, in terms of the law being a deterrent, that we have some restrictions, some regulation on firearms, making them safer, etc.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I think I understand here. The reason that you don't have additional regulations like that is, well, because they're not specific actions. Driving while intoxicated is an action. You have to do something. You have to start the car, put it in drive, and start driving. Now, I know that there are some instances out there where somebody sleeping in their driver's seat in the parking lot will get a DUI, and I don't agree with that. I think that's asinine. But for the most part, you get pulled over. I think there should be a legal limit because there is an inherent danger to that. And again, I don't want to get too far off into the weeds as far as drunk driving is concerned, but regulations on firearms, what it really boils down to is somebody possessing a firearm of any kind, be it a select fire M4 with an M203 grenade launcher attachment, is not an inherent danger because you don't know that person's intent. It could be used for good, it could be used for bad. Negligence should be prosecuted, and as well as malicious acts should be prosecuted on a different level. But somebody just having it, that's not that's not a that's not an act that in any way infringes upon the rights of others.
I see what you're getting at in terms of the matter of intent and so forth. That I think what people would tend to come back with is, well, should people be able to possess nitro, or should they be able to have make toxic chemicals in their house even though they haven't done anything wrong with it? The chances of a terrible tragedy occurring if something does go wrong is so high that maybe we should have some safety in place, that type of thing. And I think that's what that's what we're getting at on our side. I think this the the belief out there, or that you often hear, that folks on our side of things want to ban all guns or take guns from people and things like that. That's just not true. I think it's just reasonable regulation, improving the safety, uh, things of that nature. uh, that is more in line with, I think, what people want. um,
Right.
and that's where we're going here. But again, there are purists on both sides of this, but I don't think most of the people that I know are purists and fall into that category.
Right. No, I believe I know that my mindset is not uh, particularly popular. It's not shared by the majority of Americans. I wish it were. But really, what it boils down to, you mentioned somebody creating mustard gas or something like that, which is
Hmm.
really easy to do. All it takes is a quick internet search, and you'll see that mixing bleach and ammonia will do it.
Hmm.
It's really easy, but you still don't see a lot of people doing it. And you could do it without law enforcement having uh, any sort of idea that that's happening. And you can also see that because somebody could get away with possessing that, they don't, because there's not a real want for it. And
Hmm.
really, the thing is, and again, I don't think that the mere possession of anything should constitute a crime or even a civil penalty. I think possession is, unless you're in possession of stolen property, that's a different story. Uh, so, you talk about you want sensible regulations. And the
Hmm.
thing is that the average gun rights supporter, not me particularly, but the average person believes that, well, I am included in this group. When I say not me, I'm not talking about my specific mindset, but the average gun owner mentality is that, it starts this way. Gun
Hmm.
control and gun confiscation never happens overnight. And I do believe that the majority of people who support gun control honestly believe the way that you just said, that you just want sensible gun regulations in your mind in order to deter or prevent crime.
Hmm.
But the thing is, you can see throughout history that started in 1934 with the National Firearms Act, then 1938 with the Federal Firearms Act, 1968 with the Gun Control Act, 1986 with FOPA, 1988 with the Undetectable Firearms Act, 1990 with the Gun Free School Zones Act. It just keeps going on and on and on. And I promise that everybody that was lobbying for that never said, "Oh yeah, we want to do gun confiscation." But I don't mean you specifically. You see that these groups have been chipping away at our rights little by little over the decades. And the right to defend yourself is an inherent right, and the means by which you do that should only be limited to what your most significant threat could ever possess. And because our most significant threat is from a militia member standpoint would be the government. It could turn that way, or if you want to get all Red Dawny, an invading force. But because that threat could be out there, you should be able to possess any means to defend against that type of threat. And, I trust you that you say that you only want sensible regulations, but
Hmm.
really the thing is, every place that is now gun free, like Australia and the UK, they started off that way with sensible regulations, and now it's illegal to possess a firearm in the UK, and you see stabbings happening constantly. I read a report recently that said that. Uh, Hang on, let me see if I can find it here. Uh, yeah, so you have the homicide rate, or I'm sorry, violent crime rate in the UK is 2,000 crimes per 100,000. Uh, that's 2% of the population has to deal with violent crimes, whereas on our end, we have 0.3%, and zero point 0.1 of which are committed with firearms. Really, what it boils down to, for me, is that in a situation like Florida, I would much rather have somebody who's just walking down the street, minding their own business with a Select Fire M4 on their back, notice that and take action, than wait 7 to 12 minutes to have police arrive and then, in the case of Florida, do nothing.
Well, I think it's just a matter of what we want um, our life and our society to be. I mean, what is your if I'm hearing you correctly? I mean, we don't have the mass shooting problems in other nations, other civilized, advanced nations around the world. Now, you have incidents that will happen, but nothing on the scale, mass shooting wise, like you have in the United States. Um, I personally know people from England, from Australia, from Europe, who they have a very hard time understanding the fascination with firearms in the United States. The the shootings that they do see and hear about, it's just unfathomable. They just almost can't believe it, and they wouldn't trade. They wouldn't trade it. They just can't even imagine the possibility of wanting to carry a gun around. And so there's something about America, there's something about this society that um, involves this having this ability to inflict violence or in defense of oneself that doesn't seem to exist in other countries. And that's possibly maybe that's something we need to get at and crack eventually, is if you talk about intent or motivations. Why do we need to resolve disputes violently? I would argue that there seems to be a prevalence for that in our society, and I don't know why that is. And it involves, you have road rage, and here in Austin, I know in the last probably 4 months we've had three fatal violent incidents of road rage that just started over someone cutting someone off. They get mad, someone draws a gun and shoots, or maybe they both draw a gun and shoot, and that doesn't happen in England, and it's not happening in Australia. And why is that? I guess that's the $1 million question that maybe sociologists will be able to answer decades from now. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, with the general public not being able to possess firearms, obviously your gun related violence is going to decrease rather substantially. There are still incidents that happen with firearms, but not as much. But you also see an increase of other methods. And really, I mean, if you look at it, evil's going to find a way to do what it wants. No matter what laws are in place to try and prevent that, to try and be proactive, to stop it from happening, evil's going to find a way. I mean, you see it. I mean, take a look in prisons. They are completely disarmed. It is the epitome of a police state. They're not allowed to possess anything that could be used as a weapon. Yet you see them manufacture shanks all the time. You see drug running happening in prisons. You see violence happening in prisons. And I know that this is not a good demographic to really point out, but the point that I'm trying to make is that in a completely controlled environment like a prison, violence and evil still happens because evil will always find a way. And that's really the point that I'm trying to make.
Sure, and I do agree that evil intent. There are truly evil people in the world, and there are also people with severe mental illness and so forth and so on, and they'll find a way to do something. I think what the average person worries so much about is that the evil person with the intent of causing mass casualties and inflicting them in a very short amount of time, it appears very easy for them to do that with the availability of some of the firepower that's out there. Um, you could make the argument that if it was more difficult, it wouldn't happen quite as often. You wouldn't have, I don't think people would be building truck bombs quite as often and so forth and so on. But that gets to how the gun violence problem has torn at the fabric of our society, where people, either rightly or wrongly, just don't feel safe in the public square, or they feel like their freedom of movement is being restricted because they have to worry about, oh, is a guy going to walk in the theater now? Am I going to be trapped? These types of things. And I remember as a kid in, the 70s and the 80s even, this is just something that never entered my mind. And I don't think it entered the mind of most people. But now it's constantly on your mind wherever you go. And as you say, statistics don't necessarily bear that out that it's a huge threat. But that is a restriction on our freedom because you're not allowed to be truly free because you're always having to think about potential for violence. And so that's part of the impact, I think, that people want to be able to feel a little free from this. And it appears to many people as if guns are everywhere, so you can't escape it.
To that, I would respond by saying this: the mere presence of a gun should not make anybody uncomfortable, because the second that something does happen, the first thing they do is they call the police, who bring guns. And I can't understand why people get uncomfortable at the sight of a firearm on somebody in civilian clothes, uh, because quite frankly, if it's in a holster or it's slung around their back or whatever, it's not a threat. It's just an inanimate object. I think a lot of that has to do with the perpetuation by the media. And you know what? You are right about one thing. I carry constantly. I carry every day. And the reason that I carry is because I don't want to become a statistic. I would much rather be the survivor who was able to, at minimum, save my own life. And if I had the opportunity to save others, I would definitely do that. Not because I want, glory or to be a hero or anything, but because I believe it's our human duty to protect everybody else from any sort of violence like that. And I think, again, going back to education, if people were to understand that firearms in and of themselves are not evil, and that anybody can safely operate one with really minimal instruction. It doesn't take much to learn how to disassemble a firearm, and it doesn't take much to learn how to properly employ one. I think that the world would be a much safer and much freer place, because should something happen, you're not waiting 7 to 12 minutes for law enforcement to arrive. You're waiting 2 to 3 seconds to pull that weapon out of your holster and return fire, and at least stop the attacker from killing other people. Maybe you can keep his head down until law enforcement can show up, or maybe you can take him out right there and neutralize the threat and save a lot of lives in the process. to me, all of these other additional regulations and even the current regulations that we have on the books, all they do is deter people like me, who are the vast majority of people in this country. Uh, that's not entirely accurate. The vast majority of people who own guns, uh, and that includes the criminal element. You want a deterrent. What better a deterrent than to have a room full of armed citizens capable of returning fire with equal or even greater firepower than the criminal possesses?
But that sounds as if, though, that you would be advocating more guns equal more safety. And is that what, if more people were armed, if we had more people carrying guns on the street, your argument would then be that we would be safer?
I firmly believe that. I do. And, you know, no matter what laws you have in place, accidents will happen as they currently do. But overall, I think you will see much more, uh, a much less loss of life from homicides. I think that you will see a crime rate that will decrease because if you think about it, to nobody's going to want to inflict violence on somebody that they know has the capability to fight back and fight back in an adequate and effective manner.
So let's say if you're openly carrying, which there's a difference between open and concealed carry. If you're openly carrying in an environment where someone has the intent to do harm, wouldn't you think you would be their first target?
I have heard that. I've heard that talking point a lot. I'm somebody that open carries most of the time. There are times where I conceal, um, and to be honest, you could make a case for both. It really is it's a preference. And do I think that you'll be the target? It depends on who the assailant is. It depends on what their mindset is. In some cases, yes. In other cases, no. I would argue that in most cases, if they saw that, they would turn around and, at minimum, wait for you to leave. Uh, and to be completely honest, what's funny is I have open carried into places, and they never saw the fact that there was a 1911, which, if you're not familiar, is a rather sizable handgun on my hip, and it's in plain view for everybody to see without any sort of concealment going on. People just haven't noticed. Now, from a criminal standpoint, they'll probably be looking for something like that. But you have law enforcement that open carries. They're required by law to open carry. You have, our military, we open carry. And the reason is, one, I feel, as a personal preference, it's more comfortable, and I have more control over my weapons employment. I can do it faster and more effective. But I think that people should have the choice to whether they want to carry concealed or if they want to carry openly.
But you also, if I'm reading it correctly, you are opposed to mandatory training and licensing requirements, which is, I think it's 4 hours, like you mentioned. That's not that great of an imposition on your time, and to have the license, um, what why do you not favor that? Because that would just seem to be, that's the minimum that we could do to show that, hey, I know what I'm doing, I've got a license for this, they did a background check, etc., and so I'm carrying this around.
Well, for a couple of reasons. Like I said, I believe that anytime you have a license or a regulation on a natural right, it strips it of its natural right status and makes it a government given privilege. From another standpoint, there are times uh, where somebody might need protection now. Maybe they are under a specific threat. Maybe they are a newly divorced 20-year-old woman who got into a very bad marriage early off in life, and now they're going through a divorce, and she fears for her life. Well, if she doesn't have her LTC, then she is limited to her protection in her house and in her car. She's not limited. She's not able to protect herself anywhere else. And, I know that we could kind of what if the situation to death. But it really boils down to one, it doesn't take that much to learn how to operate a firearm. Two, there are already courses out there in the private sector. Three, anybody who goes to purchase a firearm, if they don't already know how to use it, chances are the vast majority of them, the first thing that they're going to do is ask questions from either their gun owning friends or seek out one of those courses. I think the mindset is already there for the vast majority of people who carry that, or who want to carry, or even just want to own a gun, that they want to know how to employ it properly. I think that that's already there, and I don't think that you have to mandate it by government.
And so you would then you don't favor background checks either.
No, I don't. I said that earlier, and I know that a lot of people, even some of our members at Lone Star Gun Rights, will probably think I'm nuts. And here's the thing. Again, they're natural rights. To me, it says, this is a right granted from beyond government, and if somebody has paid their debts to society, and for no matter what crime, if they've paid their debts to society and they're being released back into the public, you are entrusting them to live their life as a model citizen or as a reformed citizen. And if you're going to do that, then they should have all of their rights restored, because they're rights. They're not privileges contingent upon good behavior. The laws that prevent convicted violent felons from possessing a firearm don't do anything, or if they do something, it's a negligible amount, because repeat offenders repeat the crime anyway because they are able to get their firearms. Further, you have people who are flagged on a background check because they share a common name. And also, you can have somebody, no matter how stringent the background check, pass with flying colors because there are no documented offenses in their background, and their motives could be that they want to go shoot up a school. And you can also have somebody who just got out of prison because he committed armed robbery at 18 and learned his lesson, and now he just wants to protect himself. And you're depriving him of his rights, and the guy with the clean background, it's doing nothing to stop him. So that's pretty much most of the reasons that I oppose background checks.
Well, my question would be then, what about people with, let's say, a serial history of spousal abuse or child abuse or stalking or brandishing weapons in an intimidating way and so forth and so on? And let's say they have a pretty long rap sheet at the end of that. I mean, there's pretty good evidence out there that those people are serial criminals in that sense. And should that person then be allowed to buy as many weapons as they would like? I mean, that's one thing where we get into an issue here, which you can even then extend that to mental illness. There are some people that are just sociopathic, and there might, in my personal opinion, is sometimes the bar on the background check for mental health issues is a little too high, as we saw in Florida, that someone has to be adjudicated as mentally ill and unable to care for their own affairs in order for it to flag. But you can have very violent people with that are sociopathic, and they are these evil people that we talk about. Should we allow them? I mean, have they given up their opportunity? They are not able to handle the rights that most of us enjoy. They aren't able to go about their daily lives without hurting people. And those are the people that I think people would hope a background check could catch. I know it can be, you can get around it, and they might find other ways to do it. But do we need to make it easier for those people to obtain a gun?
Again, as I've said before, this violent crime in this country has never been a significant issue. Uh, just going back to statistics, in 1980, we had the worst homicide rate on record in the United States. It was 10.2 per 100,000, or as I like to say in a percentage, 0.01%, 0.0102% of Americans. Of those, 0.007% of Americans were murdered at the barrel of a firearm of some kind. It's not a substantial issue, and I don't think that infringing upon the rights of all Americans, whether they currently own a gun or would probably buy one in the future, uh, I don't think that that's something that should be done to address a problem that, from a statistical standpoint, doesn't exist. And, because you're instituting a policy that affects everybody in order to try and prevent something that affects less than 0.1% of Americans on our worst year on record.
Well, and I think that's a philosophical difference in the sense of how we view laws and the purpose of laws. And earlier I mentioned speed limits and seatbelts and things, and that's taking that out to an extreme. But it's, do you believe that laws also do have some preventative effect? In should they have some preventative effect for public safety? Does the community have a responsibility to promote public safety? And one of the in my discussions similar to this that I've had, one of the things that emerges is we basically have a difference of philosophy in the community's responsibility to promote public safety versus the individual's responsibility to promote public safety. And what I've noticed a lot is that it appears folks on the gun right side believe it's an individual responsibility more than other things, where on the other side, we tend to believe that the community does have a responsibility to try to promote public safety. So maybe that's a root cause of this difference here.
You know,
Um,
uh,
eh,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but
sure.
I actually agree with both, to be completely honest. I do think that we as individuals should take responsibility for our personal security. That said, it's not, I think that as a community, we should gather together to, in our neighborhoods and uh, have discussions like this, have training like this, just on a community level, on a neighborhood type level. Have somebody kind of like your neighborhood watch guy, but instead of neighborhood watch, his role is to help make sure that everybody's questions regarding firearms and employment and all of that are answered. And so, on certain levels, it is individual, on others, it is community. But where I think the real difference is that I don't believe that the community should have the authority to infringe upon the rights of others. And as an example of that, uh, if if your community, if 99.9% of them voted that you should not be allowed to own the property that you own and it should go to the community, that's not how that works. Your property is protected by law and by the Ninth Amendment of the Constitution. And it doesn't matter how many people, if you were the only dissenting vote on that, you still have the right to own that property because you were the one who owns it. And so, if you transfer that over to firearm ownership, I don't, to me, I don't see that even having 99% of Americans in favor of gun control, no matter how big or how small, is just, because they don't have that authority either.
Well, and that's again we were talking the philosophical difference. I think the the average American is probably somewhere in the middle of those two. Um, but that's one reason why the background check issue in polling and in general conversation, it polls well. The overwhelming majority of people support it. I think knowing that the serial nature of some type of violent crime and other types of crime, uh, that people just want a stopgap there, almost a little hesitation, um, just to try to put some barriers up to make it a little more difficult, for sociopathic people or very serial criminals, for example, into trying to get these weapons. There's always the story about impulse crimes or crimes of passion or something where someone goes out and gets a gun and then commits the crime, and a lot of times that doesn't happen. That's true. But I think the average American does believe in some limits, and that's when we talk about common sense regulations. I think people want to respect the rights of others and they want to respect all rights. And there are many of us who would believe that we should have the right to go to the park and not have guns there. I mean, just as if some people oppose gun free zones, there are people they just don't feel comfortable having their children in an area with guns, and we could try to dissect why that is, but it is true, and people feel very passionate about that as well. So, how do we balance those needs? How do we meet the public safety needs of both of these groups? And that's why we have such conflict right now. I think is there's a lot of people talking at each other and not talking to one another about it.
I
I'm
think that's
confident,
it.
yeah, and I'm confident that the answer lies somewhere in the middle. Neither side of this is going to get everything we want. That's that's for sure. That's just kind of the history of this country. But I think you could make the argument very plausibly that what we're doing right now is not working. Now, it may be working on a statistical level, but in terms of society and the way people feel and the way people, whether they feel safe or not, it's obviously not working because many people feel unsafe. So that's why I think we need to be open to different things. And the way to get to that is through conversations like this one and other conversations in open forums where I really think, I mean, I've done several of these forums, and if you can establish good rules where you try to reduce sloganeering and you try to reduce the number of talking points, and that you're required to actually listen a certain number of minutes instead of talk all the time, that does foster a good conversation about understanding people's motivations, and then I think you can have a clearer discussion about solutions after that.
I absolutely agree. I think that you're right in the sense that the average American would probably support, uh, some forms of gun control, whether that be new gun control laws or just what's already on the books. But I think that the reason that they believe that is because, and this is going to sound really bad, but I don't intend it to be. So, if I'm running for office in the future, please don't hold this against me. I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to make it sound as bad as it is. But I think that most Americans, when they hear an issue like this, they don't really delve down to the depths of either side. They pick one of the sides that sounds greatest on the surface and run with that. And that's why I think conversations like this are so important, because I really, really think that if you have these in depth conversations where you delve down, as deeply as you can go, that people will be far more in tune with why they believe a certain way as opposed
Hmm.
to they believe a certain way.
Well,
And
and I think it's important not only just to understand why the opposition believes the way they do, but why you believe the way you do
absolutely.
in terms of, and so there's self discovery there. And that doesn't necessarily mean that people end up changing their positions wildly, but in order to get past of kind of an us versus them conflict, which is another thing that charges this discussion, there's this conflict there. There are people that want to oppress me, or there are people that want to take my guns away, or people that want to shoot me, etc. Usually the reasons go much deeper than that. And that's a big part, I believe, that we need to break past if we're going to solve or address this problem, is to be able to understand people and their motivations. To be able to talk to one another again. We've done um, too much posting online, too much, reading articles that your friends have posted and so forth and so on, versus talking to people about these issues. That's why I like doing interviews like this.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to talk more. And,
Yeah.
you talk about self discovery. I actually used to support some forms of gun control back in the day. And what got me to change is because I had conversations like this. Typically, the vast majority of them were with people that were more like minded with you than they were with me at the time.
Hmm.
And the more I talk about it, the more I realize things like, well, this thing that I support no longer makes sense because I'm arguing this point on these grounds, and logically they don't line up. And,
Hmm.
whenever you have conversations like this, it really does help you solidify or rethink your position. And,
Hmm.
the reason that I believe in the Second Amendment in its purest level is because of, the research that I've done and the conversations that I've had. And,
Hmm.
I really appreciate your time. I know that we have gone, we're at an hour and 20 minutes now. And I really, truly appreciate you coming on, you taking the time to come on the program and just talk about this. I know that we don't agree, and that's
Hmm.
okay. And I'm glad that we can talk about this. And I would hope that we can do this again.
I,
On
I would love to. Yeah, I'd love to. I think it would be a very good idea every once in a while to talk about issues, especially as things come up in the news and so forth and so on. Um, that it's a good way to remind people that there's something behind people's views. And just as you mentioned, one of the reasons I came to where I am on this is I've talked to too many victims, and I've just talked to, parents who lost their kids, parents who lost their kids at Sandy Hook, parents who lost their kids at the Aurora Theater shooting. And having kids that age, it did something to me, one on an emotional level, but it kind of changed the way that I kind of view the broader perspective. So, and I think that we all need to understand there are incidents like that in all of our lives that influence the way we think about these things. So,
Absolutely.
in order to get out of the conflict, we've got to do more talking.
Absolutely. These are all complex issues. They're not simple.
Yes, very much
And
so.
even a purist like myself recognizes that. And that's why we need more of these conversations to look at every single aspect. Anyway,
Absolutely.
Ed, I'm going to let you go. I don't want to take up any more of your time. You've already been more than gracious, and I truly appreciate it. If you ever want to come back on and have another discussion, you have an open invitation, my friend.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. You have a good day.
You too. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
That was an awesome conversation. I truly hope that you enjoyed it. Please subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, your favorite podcasting app, or even on YouTube as well to stay up to date with our latest episodes. And please consider sharing this with everybody that you know, pro gun control, whichever. And let's encourage more dialogue. Until next Sunday, Lone Star Gunners, arm yourself with knowledge and share the ammo. Lone Star Gun Talk is a Lone Star Gun Rights production, hosted and edited by Derek Wills. Copyright 2018.